Kerry, thank you very much for presenting a large amount of information with enormous clarity. Personally, I thought it was extremely insightful in terms of how the system works and what the factors are for giving the court guidance to make decisions. So we'll move on to the next presenter, who it's my pleasure to introduce. This is Stan Korosi. Stan is a professional counsellor and psychotherapist who specialises in parental alienation and parent-child reunification. He's a member of the International Parental Alienation Study Group, which comprises 340 mental health and legal professional members across 32 countries. He's currently undertaking research as a PhD candidate at Gold Coast University into the social definition of parental alienation. Stan, thanks for coming along.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here. So I'm going to take a fairly broad and at times deep perspective on parental alienation. I suspect most of you have probably Googled it by now. Is that correct? Lots of nodding heads. So you'll know some of what I'm about to talk about. So Kerry's talk was great because we have a legal context for this. And what I will say is that parental alienation occurs... Oh, hang on. Yeah. Parental alienation actually occurs in a family context. So we're calling it really a social phenomena. But where it comes to the crunch, where we actually see it, is in family law, because that's where people come with problems caused by it. So let's make a start. This is where it comes to the crunch. So we know what the law says. Kerry has given us a very cogent explanation of that. This is an extract from what we call reasons for judgment, where a judge has made a determination in a case in which I believe parental alienation was alleged. In this particular case, I understand that the judge ordered the child to remain in the care of the parent who was alleged to have alienated them. In this case, the mother. Now, if you read those statements fairly carefully, the judge is openly acknowledging that they are validating bad behaviour, bad parenting. I'm using this not as a critique of law, but as an example of how we don't understand socially what actually parental alienation means. We don't actually have a social understanding of a child being coerced to believe something about a parent whom they love in order to reject them. And so the judges are stuck. You know, they can only work with what they're given. They can only work with the experts who advise them. So look at the next statement, which is remarkable in its own right. In that particular statement, the judge is acknowledging that the mother is going, in this case, is going to keep essentially emotionally abusing the child for as long as that child has a relationship with the father. So somehow it's now been construed as being in the child's best interest that they don't have a relationship with their father, but they maintain a relationship with a parent who's arguably abusing them. That is a hell of a quandary for a judge to be in. Okay? I think it's useful to try and appreciate what the coerced rejection of a parent means and I use that term interchangeably with parental alienation, that it doesn't just exist on its own. Okay? So you think of it as a spectrum of possible family relationships. And right at the bottom there, in nice cool blue, is the notion of a positive, normal, secure relationship between a parent and a child. Okay? Those of you who have teenagers might really question whether that's possible, but generally speaking, it is. Okay? Now, it is actually normal in families for children to align themselves with one parent, but not necessarily rupture their relationship with the other. And sometimes that's as simple as, you know, the same-sex parent-child relationship, mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, and that can occur at different developmental stages. And sometimes it's the opposite. You know, boys want to get closer to their mums, girls want to get closer to their dads. Nothing actually wrong with that, and the child remains what we call ambivalent to both parents. When we get into estrangement, we're talking about something different, and generally speaking, when a child is estranged from one parent, there is a reason why that has happened, and it's typically because there has been abuse, family violence, sexual abuse, negligent parenting might be another reason. So we actually sometimes call that realistic estrangement. And it's actually sometimes confused with the next one, which is alienation, where there's actually almost a pathological aspect to it. The child's rejection of a parent is harsh, it's unreasonable, it's irrational, doesn't make sense. They may refer to their parent by their first name. Now that's a very powerful indicator that something terrible has happened, because when dad becomes Bob and mum becomes Sally, we've been demoted as parents. You know, so these are indicators that something badly wrong has happened, and because the other parent has actually coerced the child into doing that, usually by way of a highly conditional relationship. So useful to see that as a spectrum. The trick is locating where a particular relationship issue lies on that spectrum. So I hope you can all see that. It's useful to talk about how the process actually works, because parental alienation is quite unique. It's actually a form of, we can arguably say, triangulated abuse. And triangulated relationships are well known in family systems, where you have two people in a system. Ever heard of the saying, two's company, three's a crowd? Well, this is an extreme version of that. So two people will form a very close relationship, and a third one is quite at the other end, almost excluded from the relationship, but still hanging in there tenaciously. With alienation, what happens is that what we call the favoured parent has a quite complicated, hostile, loving relationship with their partner. They then engage the child using a variety of alienation processes, sometimes outright bullying and coercion, but sometimes quite subtle processes, to get them to change the nature of their relationship with the parent whom they love. So what happens then is that a formally secure, loving relationship with a parent becomes what we call fearful and avoidant. The child avoids that parent. They become fearful of that parent. Sometimes the favoured parent makes allegations of family violence. We've heard from Kerry that these need to be treated quite seriously. Sometimes there's no substance to those allegations, yet they have to be looked into. The child becomes fearful. The creation of a climate of fear that has no reason, no rationale behind it, is one of the aspects, one of the tactics that we know that alienating parents use. So what happens to the child here is that we call it splitting. It's another way of saying dissociation. They are placed in an impossible loyalty conflict. They love both parents. One parent's message to them is, I love you, but only if you love me the way I want you to. You have to reject your other parent in order for me to love you. And what happens is that the child has to sometimes mirror the same emotional state as the favoured parent. Now, before I go any further, I'm noticing we have some older people in the audience, and I'm using the word parent. We could also call this grandparent alienation, okay? Because one of the indicators of alienation is that the whole extended family is cut off, okay? And this is a very big indicator that something terrible has happened along the lines of alienation. So this is an impossible situation for a child to resolve. So the way they resolve it is to split or dissociate away the parent whom they love They then attribute to that parent harsh and negative attributions that don't make sense. It's a way of internally justifying to themselves how they're resolving that conflict. It doesn't make sense, it's harmful to them, and there's plenty of research done to show that this is damaging to the children. So just to simplify it a bit, I'm going to look at this in terms of power, abuse of power, because that's a big aspect in family violence. Family violence is ultimately an abuse of power. Typically in family violence, one partner targets the other partner. The child is often a helpless witness, sometimes caught up in it, but generally speaking, the child is not usually the target of family violence, although they can be indirectly, as we heard from Kerry. With alienation, we actually have a triangulated abuse. The real target is the other parent. The child is simply a weapon. Okay? So let's see what we're talking about. There have been a number of attempts to define what parental alienation is over the 30-odd years since Dr. Richard Gardner first observed it in clinical settings, 1985 I think it is. He formulated it then as a disorder, and he tried to call it parental alienation syndrome. Now, many of us would say that he was premature in doing that. It wasn't recognised as a syndrome pathologically, diagnostically. So then you roll forward to the 21st century, and it's been reformulated in a more relational kind of way as a child exhibiting the unreasonable negative attributions of a parent that are unjustified by their past relationship with that parent. And one of the things that tends to shock parents who have been rejected by their children this way is how quickly it changes. They have a loving relationship with their child 1 minute, next minute it's extremely hostile. So then the next formulation again is a kind of a relational formulation of a disturbance in a relational context. So around this time I think one of the first formulations of parental alienation was done in attachment theory. Does anyone know what I mean by attachment theory? Yep, some of you will have done your research on that. And then we roll forward to the last one, which is a very technical, process-oriented description of essentially an attachment disruption or an attachment disorder. So this is a relatively recent attempt to have a diagnostic basis for parental alienation. There are in fact categories within the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual version 5 that are applicable to parental alienation, and there moves afoot to have it recognised in the International Classification of Diseases. So what emerges out of this, if we look at all the experts on parental alienation, we mostly agree on what it is. What we tend not to agree on is how we would assess it, how would we identify it. That leaves us with some big questions. Anyone want to venture an answer to last question? Any suggestions? Yep, all of the above. Plus. So it is heading down the pathological path. We do expect that there will be some diagnostic categories applicable to it. There is a recent paper being published that shows that a parental acceptance and rejection instrument can actually tell the difference between a child who is alienated and a child who is estranged. So that's a recent development. It is a relationship presentation in a family context. It is certainly a social phenomenon. And in a broad context, we often read about how society in various ways is actually an alienated society. So this might well be a manifestation of that. Societal conditions speaks to that notion that society reflects the conditions in which families operate. So if society is fundamentally alienating, then families are at risk of repeating that. So I would agree, it's all of the above. which is why I'm doing research into its social construction so that we can have a social discussion about it in the same way that we have a social discussion about family violence and child abuse. We're not having those discussions about parental alienation just yet. So one of the issues we have in a legal context is that parental alienation tends to fool the experts. The conventional thinking is what we call family systems thinking, and that is the idea that we all tend to co-create the relationships that we have, okay? And so very often when parents are engaged with family consultants by way of court order, the family consultant tends to view the family as a system and looks at the involvement and contribution of all of the parties. The issue with alienation is that it is predominantly the influence of one parent, not the other one, that causes a child to reject that parent. So the temptation is to then view the rejected parent actually as part of the problem. Then what happens is that those parents, sometimes in desperation to address the issue, actually do things inadvertently that makes the alienation worse. And that's not because they're bad parents. That's because there's no guidance on what to do or how to do it. So then we get into the issues of risk and safety, where allegations of violence and sexual abuse are made. And so these have to be treated seriously. So then the experts are confronted with a parent who's been rejected by a child. The child is making plausible allegations about that parent. There's a risk notice. The matter's treated seriously. It has to be investigated. A year later, we're still enmeshed in the family law system. Some of you may have experiences of that. Okay? In the context of child abuse and family violence, there's a temptation to view the child's testimony as being fundamentally truthful. The problem is there's plenty of evidence to suggest that children can be made to believe something that is absolutely untrue. Has anyone heard of Slender Man? Some of you have. Slender Man is a mythical internet figure created by a very disturbed individual. Slender Man is followed by a number of adolescents and teenagers, and he has commanded them to kill. And they have done so, because Slender Man told them to. Okay? We know about radicalisation. We know that teenagers can be susceptible to false information that plays to their notions of trying to find their place in the world. And we know that research has been done that false memories can actually be implanted. And in that implantation, children and indeed adults will recount those memories as though they were witnesses to something, even though it never happened. This haunts some forensic investigators. The other aspect that is counterintuitive is that the solution to the alienation problem is to actually put the child with the parent whom they've rejected. Now that's a difficult one to grasp, because it is a case of prescribing the symptom. When the temptation is to view the rejected parent as part of the problem, the idea of putting the child with someone you consider part of the problem doesn't quite fit. The other angle here is, and some of you will have had experiences of working with various practitioners in an alienation context, and many of them just don't get the idea that they're working in a delusional system. And the temptation for counsellors and psychotherapists, and I'm one of them, so I know, I was brought up this way, is to take the view that someone's lived experience is actually valid. And some of them recount that experience so plausibly that we have no reason to disbelieve them, except it's a total fantasy. And that's a real dilemma to determine that. I wish we had some reliable figures to actually put some numbers to the scale of the problem. in Australia anyway. All we have is some small-scale studies that don't generalise to the larger population. But there are indicators that it's a growing problem. So, you know, we have, at least in 2001, probably nearly 30% of divorce judgments involve some aspect of alienation. That's a very restricted study in one particular city, and it was more than a decade ago, at a different time when alienation was understood in a different way. So roll forward to 2012, we have some indicators again that it is a growing problem. Again, a small-scale study. We need to know more about it at a social level. So the trick in all of this is the proper assessment and perhaps diagnosis of parental alienation. In the family law context, the judges rely, when a matter goes to trial, if it doesn't get resolved in mediation, judges rely heavily on expert witness reports. If the experts don't get it and they don't assess it properly, then they're left with nothing, left with whatever they have to work with, whatever that is. So it is down to clinical judgment. It is down to using multiple sources of information about the family. It is about treating parental alienation as part of a differential assessment. A child rejects a parent. What are the possible plausible hypotheses for that? Family violence is one. Negligent parent is another one. High conflict, hostile relationships one. Parental alienation is another one. There should really be a differential assessment of that. One of the issues we face professionally is there's no universal agreement on what is an assessment methodology or assessment criteria for this. So that makes life hard in a legal context. So Richard Gardner defined 8 criteria for parental alienation. Many people hold these up as a gold standard. They are an easy phenomenological way of understanding alienation, and his 8 criteria are generally reflected across most expert definitions of parental alienation. You know, the campaign of denigration against a parent, the parroting of, you know, words and allegations by the parent, the harsh and unreasonable rejection. You know, all of these criteria you see in all the definitions. But they're not diagnostic. You have to use so much clinical judgment and evaluation to assess it. There's also 32 parental alienation strategies that have been identified. That doesn't mean that's all there is, because we're only limited by imagination on that one. So some of the strategies involve, you know, allowing a parent to be denigrated, called a bastard or an arsehole by the child, where the favoured parent either encourages that or does nothing to stop it. So they're passively encouraging it. Okay? Interception of mail is another one. Monitoring of telephone calls is another one. Encouraging and coercing a child to spy on the other parent. I've had a case where an adolescent child was found wandering through the house on a rare access visit with an iPad video recording the contents of the house whilst she was on a mobile phone to her other parent. Okay? So they're quite extreme. Replacing a parent with another parent, it's like a step-parent. Okay? So there's a whole range of these things, and they're highly correlated with the outcomes of rejection. So there's another way of assessing it. So one of the issues we have is a lack of professional development in parental alienation. So most practitioners, certainly those involved in family law, will have had ample education in family systems, will have done professional development in family violence. They will know how to consider if there is a violence issue, an abuse issue. Very few of them in my view, have adequate professional development in alienation. So they don't have the basis to work with it. And I talked about the differential assessment of alienation before. What I see in my work, because sometimes I'm asked to do shadow reports. In other words, a rejected parent will say, I'm not happy with the family report I've got. It's critical of me. They didn't understand. They didn't consider all the evidence. Their legal counsel will ask me to review the report. And what I sometimes see is what I call targeting of the targeted parent. It's their fault. And in many cases, these reports ignore the obvious, like the encouraged or passively encouraged denigration of a parent. And again, that goes back to the comment I made about professional development. And as I said, rejected parents are in a terrible dilemma. If you don't fight, you lose. It's that simple. Okay? But if you fight, you're seen to be part of the problem. Okay? And that's part of the setup. If the dynamic could be understood that you're fighting for your children's lives in the context of alienation, it might be viewed differently if that was understood socially. Okay? Now I want to take a much broader sociological perspective on this, because we need to look at this from a social alienation point of view and a de-alienation point of view. So at a social level, what alienation does, parental alienation does, is it actually damages, if not destroys, the social identity of the rejected parent. Okay? So I've had some parents who've asked me, am I still a parent? So if a child dies, are you still a parent? Yep. You don't lose that identity. If a child goes missing, well, you're still a parent. Look at the Morecambes, they're still parents. Okay? If your child's kidnapped, you're still a parent. So in all those cases, not only do parents still retain their identity, but society has a way of acknowledging the terrible grief, the anger, the outrage of what has happened. If your child is alienated from you, who are you? Well, did you do something to make that happen? You must have done, because I saw Home and Away and they all hated each other in those families. Must be a soap opera thing. Okay? So then, individually, this has profound profound outcomes. Hope that can be edited out. So there's a rupture in what parents believe their roles as parents are, what society makes of them, about their relationship with society. So some alienated parents are actually quite traumatised. And that impacts their capacity to engage with their children strategically. So then they get bad assessments because they're actually traumatised. Okay? So at a societal level, we're talking here about a profound rupture in what family means, what parent-child relationships mean, when we allow this to happen in silence. So we need a new social discourse around it. That's why I'm doing the research. We need a social discourse that says, actually, this is wrong. We say family violence is wrong. The big difference between family violence and parental alienation is that family violence was observed in social settings and parental alienation was observed in clinical settings. And so we need different ways of working with people who are exposed to alienation processes, and we need to re-identify parents who have been rejected as valid parents. So because we're not talking about parental alienation, it grows in silence, and this is exactly what happened with family violence. Roll back 20, 30 years ago, people didn't talk about it, and so it was allowed to happen. And every time I talk to someone about parental alienation, somebody knows someone to whom this has happened, but they don't know what to say. So the question is, if we had a social dialogue, would the laws be interpreted differently, or would there be different laws? And so judges in our family law system have a great deal of discretion. Would they look at an alienating presentation differently if they accepted it as a very serious form of abuse? And as Kerry pointed out, there is actually a functional description of parental alienation as an example of family violence in the Family Law Act, so they do know about it. It's what to do about it is the issue. Actually, parental alienation is illegal in some countries. It's actually in the Family Law Act in Brazil, quite specifically as an illegal act. There are punishments for it. And in some European Community countries, it's actually proscribed by certain professional bodies. Thank you.